Well, welcome everyone, and oh, welcome Elsie. I'm so grateful to be able to do this with you. You know, I just absolutely adore you and admired you my whole life, and
Oh,
and know that you just bring such a warmth and so much love and wisdom and just this feeling. And the easiest thing about you is I don't have to do anything here because you just go into this feeling and then it all flows out of you. And I know I'll just get us started for a bit, and then I'll hide and you can say everything else. But for those who were there last week or have seen the video that we launched last week with the insight, which was a really powerful video of Sid telling his story. And I said, he has to tell his story, his experience. We can't possibly know on that. None of us have ever really gone into that world. But Elsie, you were there before and you saw the transformation, you saw around it. So today we're going to talk about what happened, what you saw, and also take a little time for us to sort of honor and really respect and recognize where this came from. Because what's amazing about Sid is, well, many things, but it didn't come from some intellectual understanding. He didn't sit down with a pad of paper and a bunch of books and work it out. And seeing how it came to him, seeing this spontaneous epiphany that came to him, just reminds us that it's in everybody, that we all have this wisdom, and that this isn't something we want to pursue intellectually. We want to rediscover it inside this feeling. And thank God you have the most beautiful feeling. I know you're going to take us there and take us inside to where he found it, where you found it. And you've been speaking for almost 50 years about what you discovered, your wisdom, and sometimes telling a story or two about Sid. So I'm so happy you get to talk today, or I get to ask you a few questions and then just let you tell us about your experience, what you saw with Sid beforehand and during and after, and how you saw it emerge and evolve. As most of you probably know much better than I, but Elsie knew Sid before his experience and saw this ordinary, everyday, ordinary man transform and so quickly from this. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I know Sid always said I was so insecure before, but he says that, and then I heard Barb Banks tell me stories, and I thought, oh, he sounded like the kindest, sweetest, compassionate, gentle man, even though he said he was insecure. He really was just a magical person, even then, caring for people and thoughtful. So can I start this by just asking you about your not knowing him early? What was he like before the experience? What did you know about him? And tell us a little.
well, I'm going to just pause for a moment to express my thanks to you and to Chris and the board of 3PGC for giving me this privilege to share this at this level. I've shared what I've seen, before, what Ken and I saw, but somehow this 50th anniversary is so special to me. I'm almost beyond words, but I'll do my best. As I was reflecting this morning on 50 years, I mean, this has been it's been a miracle. It started with a miracle. And I don't say that lightly, because what happened to Sid was a miracle. As you said, he didn't study. He read welding books. I'm aware that he read one book when he was still at the pulp mill, when Ken was telling me about this interesting man at work. He'd worked with Sid for 8 years prior to Sid's experience. And he started talking about Scotty, as he was known at work, and just, was really complimentary about Sid's work skills as a welder, how good he was at work. And, I mean, they certainly had issues at the pulp mill. And so there was a level of insecurity there about the union, about supervisors. And when I finally did meet Sid and Barb, we had a good time talking about our insecurities. That was the first time I'd ever experienced that insecurity, if it was shared in a loving manner, could feel all right. It was far better than reveling in the misery of what was wrong. And so it was good to have friends and to be able to see it with some perspective. I'd never experienced seeing insecurity with some perspective. Now, we didn't know that that was what was happening. But as we became good friends, and Sid brought Barb over to meet with us, and there was a fellow at work that been watching a program called Kung Fu, and he told us about it. And so the four of us decided to watch this program. And Sid had been in karate for the physical exercise, and we'd seen him perform and do his artistry. And so when we began to watch Kung Fu, we were certainly taken with the artistry of the Kung Fu movements. But more than that, it was the philosophy of the master in the program and some of the words that he spoke that began to stir the four of us. Now, we felt something, but we didn't know what it was. We didn't know it was that spiritual essence within us that was being stirred. We were ignorant of that. Sid never talked in a spiritual manner before his experience. He talked about welding rods. He talked about the union. He talked about supervisors, as did Ken. That was our common ground. I had a very strong religious background, and there was some times where I would mention something spiritual to Sid in regard to the Kung Fu philosophy, but he wasn't having any of it. He wasn't really interested in that aspect of it. And we did begin to volunteer at the crisis center when you mentioned Sid's caring and Barb's caring. Barb was a nurse, and so they were very much into exploring this avenue of service. They'd never done that before. But because one of Sid and Ken's co-workers was volunteering there, again, that started to resonate within us that, gosh, maybe we can help someone. We don't seem to be helping ourselves, but let's take a crack at it and just see, maybe we can help somebody else. Because we didn't really know what service was. As I said, we couldn't really serve ourselves or each other or our family at that point. I'm speaking about myself and Ken as well. And so we began to find some deeper feelings in this service at the crisis center. And what came out of some of the conversation there and among some other friends was there was this retreat center that could help build relationships, enhance marriages, and so on. And so we were listening to that, and I heard the phrase that this retreat center offered workshops that really were upfront with each other and encouraged their participants to be upfront. And so Sid and Barb started to express a degree of interest in that, which frightened me. I thought, gosh, like, we've just found these new friends. I'm feeling that. And I did see that Sid was kind and a gentle man. I thought he was rather famous because he had a radio program where he played Scottish music. I'd never ever met anybody who had a radio program. So I thought, wow, and Sid would go, oh, it's nothing, Elsie. I just put on some records and we have Scottish music. It's really nothing. And he said, I'm pretty insecure about, if I'm playing it right or if I'm talking right. And so I felt calmed down again that, okay, so he is still insecure, even though in my vision, he was famous because of this radio show, but he's identifying his insecurity. And so I thought, okay, good guy, okay, we're still on common ground. And so I really didn't want anything to do with it. But Sid and Barb said, would you like to come? We're thinking of registering. And I was like, no way. And so they went ahead and registered. And then they told us the following week they canceled, that they also were feeling insecure about going. And I thought, oh, yay, I'm so glad that they're not going either, because I didn't want them to get ahead of us, And then we didn't hear from them one weekend. And later, I don't know, a few days later, we got a phone call from Sid, and he wondered if they could pop by for a visit. And his voice sounded different on the phone. He sounded elated, and I thought, gee, I wonder what's up. And so we said, certainly, come on over for a cup of tea. And so when they arrived, I didn't know what to make of Sid as he stood at our doorstep. I invited him in, but he looked like he'd come from a spa. Barb didn't. Barb was looking like a little stressed, I'll be honest, at that point still. This was only 3 or 4 days after what we learned was his experience. And so they came in, and he also seemed to have grown inches. In his insecurity and stress at work, he used to walk kind of hunched over, as if he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. And here he is, and he's standing tall, and his eyes are sparkling. And he looked like he had some deep facial procedure because he'd lost a lot of wrinkles on his face. And he glowed. Now I'm taken aback by this. I don't know what to make of it. And Ken just kind of ushers them in to sit down while I go ahead and make the tea. I go to join them, and we're having our tea. And I said, so what have you two been up to? And they said, well, we went to this workshop, this retreat center we were telling you about. And I said, and how was it? And Sid said it was awful. And Barb just nodded her head in agreement. It's like, oh. And I said, so what happened? He said, but while I was there, he said, I heard something that I've never heard before, that I never knew before. And as he was saying this, I got kind of chills, chicken skin, as they say in Hawaii. But I didn't know what that was. And I wondered, what is he leading up to? And he said, I heard that insecurity is thought. And I thought, what? And then he said that just resonated so deeply with me. And he said, after we left the retreat center, because it was so awful, and people and the instructors were so mean to each other, that we just couldn't bear to stay, and we went to Salt Spring. And he said, while we were on Salt Spring, something happened to me. And he paused, and again, his presence just, even as I try to describe it now, it's beyond description. It was a feeling. There was such a feeling coming from him that even though I was confused and starting to get frightened by what could it be that he was trying to tell us, I felt something solid in the room. And I said to him, so what happened, Sid? And he said, I had the simple insight, but he said it showed me the secret to life. I found the secret to life, he said. And I was taken aback, as was Ken. And I thought, secret? Like, there's a secret to life? And he said, and I also found out what God is. And Elsie, God isn't what you think it is. And that really, I drew back from that because of my religious background. I'd never heard Sid say anything about God before. And now he is saying he's found the secret to life, and he now knows what God is. I was dumbfounded. I didn't know what to say. it just, I didn't know what to say. And the next thing he said was, what I found, these spiritual gifts that were revealed to me during this simple insight, will change the fields of psychology and psychiatry. And I just shook my head. I thought, poor soul. You know, the poor man, he's gone round the bend. I don't know what happened to him at that retreat. And what on earth? I'd never heard the word insight. I didn't know what had happened to him. But I thought he'd gone round the bend, that perhaps he was having a nervous breakdown. There were a few people from the pulp mill that had had nervous breakdowns because of the stress level there. And I thought, is this starting? Like, could that retreat have put him over the edge? First of all, he says he's found the secret to life. He said he's found out what God is. Who says that? I thought, what arrogance to say that he knows what God is. All my religious upbringing, I went to a convent for a number of years. The hair stood up on the back of my neck that he would dare to say such a thing. And then to top it off, to say that what he'd uncovered, these spiritual gifts, would change the fields of psychology and psychiatry. He could not spell psychology. We never talked about psychology. We sort of went over some of the philosophy from the Kung Fu program, but psychology wasn't mentioned. Do you know what I mean? We never talked. That wasn't in our reality, psychology or psychiatry. In none of us talked about that. They left shortly after because they could just see we didn't know what to do with them. And so they were very kind. Again, in their kindness and gentleness, Sid knew we'd had enough, probably more than enough. And so off they went. Ann and I just kept shaking our heads at each other. We couldn't really talk to each other right at the moment. We were just so taken aback. But then little by little, I guess the only thing we could say is, poor man, I think he's having a nervous breakdown. How could he say this stuff? And so, they continued to visit, and Barb had her own insight after a week or something like that, where she came to see from within herself that something mystical had happened to her husband. And she began to grow herself into this incredibly wise and loving and kind and gentle woman. I often thought of Barb as having the courage of a lion and the gentleness of a doe. And there were times as our journey with Sid went on, that sometimes in those early days, Sid's presence would be too strong for me. When he would come to visit, I couldn't look at him in the eye. It was just too strong, his conviction, his certainty. And I began to ask him not to speak about this nonsense that he'd found. And yet I couldn't stop. There would be questions that would come out of me without my volition. Like, I certainly wasn't planning, well, the next time they come over, I'm going to ask them about this or that. It just came out of me. And one of the questions that began to come out was about thought. There was something about thought that got me. And so then I would ask Sid in the next visit, like, you said this the last time you were here, said that we create our own experience through thought. Like, what did you mean by that? And he would start to explain, and I'd say, oh, Sid, I don't want to hear this anymore. Please don't talk to me about this. And finally, as time went on, and I saw their relationship change from one where they'd always, had a deep love for each other. But Sid has said, even in that last tape, that they wanted a little bit of help in their marriage. And I saw them become so close. When they would come to our house, they would sit next to each other and hold hands on the sofa. And Ken and I would sit in opposite chairs at a distance. And so I saw their love grow and expand. And on one hand, I wanted that. I wanted our marriage to be enhanced in that way. But on the other hand, I was also jealous of what I saw because I didn't have it. And so as time went on, they kept changing. Sid kept changing. He would share stories of what would happen at work because he went back to work after his enlightenment. Imagine that. He went back to the pulp mill for 10 months to work. And I was talking with Ken the other day, and I said, what was that like? I remember Sid telling some stories about him going back to work, and he mentioned this also on that tape and he told us again when he went into work the first day back after his experience and sharing that with Ken and myself, that when he went to go into his locker, another workmate patted him on the shoulder and said, what are you doing? You're going into Scotty's locker. And Sid turned to face him and said, I'm Scotty. Don't you know me? And the man, was startled and moved back. And then he recognized him. But at first, he didn't recognize him because he had changed so much. And so Ken was saying that sometimes he and Sid and another workman would have to go in the pickup truck out into the field to do some checkup of some of the processes out there, curing pulp and making pulp and so on. And the driver of the truck said to Sid, what's happened to you, Sid? You look so different. I mean, were you in Hawaii? Did an aunt die and leave you some money? Is Barb being extra good to you? Like, what's happened? Like, why are you looking so good here, Scotty? And so Sid would start to share a little bit, and then the fellow that asked the question would clam up like Ken and I did. And so then Sid would gently stop talking again, to respect where people were. And during that 10 months, because of the change in Sid, the people that he used to, have sort of contentious relationships with, nothing heavy duty, but where he didn't get along, say, with a supervisor or something. All of a sudden, with this newfound love and understanding that had been released within him, he began to get along with those people that previously he had not. And funnily enough, some of the people that he had been good friends with, like Ken and myself, were starting to question him, like, what's wrong with you, Sid? How can you talk like this? You're so arrogant. Like he said in that tape, like, why don't you say you just think so? Why do you have to say, this is so? That is so annoying. And he would say to us and to Ken and myself, he'd say, well, if you went into a mechanic and asked them to fix your car, and they said, oh, I think I could do it. And another mechanic said, no, I can fix it. Who would you go to? It was like, well, yeah, clearly we would go to the mechanic that said they knew how to fix it. And so it was so funny how these relationships changed. And he began to not only fall in love with who he was, this inner Sydney Banks, the inner Barb, the inner spiritual essence of his children and family, but also with the people at work. So he showed us at that time how relationships can change just if you change. It just takes one person to change, and other people have the opportunity to change because of the change in you and the feeling that comes with that change. And I'm going to say one last thing here before I pause for a moment. One of the most profound things that happened for Sid during that 10 months was the manager of the pulp mill had been hearing things were going on. There was something kind of weird happening in the welding shop. And so he sought out Sid and invited him to come to his office to talk with him. And Sid said to him, oh, I can't do that. Like, I have to be on the floor doing the job. And the manager said, no, it's okay. The general manager said, I'll take care of it. Just come and talk with me. I'm curious. I've been hearing some stuff. So Sid was really taken by this, because he said to us, it was like an admiral on the ship asking the very lowest cook in the galley to come and talk with him. You know, the difference sort of in the culture was that vast. So he went to see him, and we knew the manager. Ken and I also knew the manager, Ken, from work, and also because we'd met him at a dance or something that the pulp mill had hosted. And Sid went to talk with him, and he never ever revealed what the conversation was, but it sounded like it was a very profound conversation. And out of that, about 2 years later, by this time, I'd already heard something after a year and a half of increasing resistance and confrontation to Sid, where what was most annoying is he never got upset with me. He just grinned at me and his eyes sparkled at me when I got annoyed at him. But finally I heard, Ken and I moved to the island, and I don't know, maybe a year after we'd moved to the island, Sid was invited to talk to the human resources department at the home office of this global company. Now, take a moment to think about that you've been employed as a welder for however many years, 8, 10 years. You have a profound insight, what Sid called a simple insight. What we found was a true enlightenment of the spiritual nature of life. And then he's invited to talk to the general manager of the pulp mill that he worked at. Sometime later, he's invited to talk with the head of human resources. Sometime later, he's invited to go to the human resources department and talk with some of the top executives. That's a pretty big jump in reality for an ex-welder who became enlightened to go and talk to the human resources department to enhance and develop the team. I was privileged to be invited along by Sid. And when we went over on the ferry from Salt Spring to Vancouver, where the home office was, Sid and I were giddy, thinking like, how unusual is life that somebody who's had a grade 9 education, has read very little except welding books, found a book in the garbage dump after his enlightenment that drew his curiosity that truth is all over. Truth is in this book I found in the garbage heap. Truth is a woman or a man, a clerk, a waitress, saying something profound that they don't even know what they're saying. Truth is all over. Off we go, giddy with elation. We get to the home office. It's rather a dark and gloomy office. We're meeting with 3 people. Sid finally says to them after 15 minutes, what do you think? Would it be okay if we went to Stanley Park? It's not far from here, and we could carry on our conversation there instead of sitting in the office. And I'm thinking to myself, well, is this how you do team building? Like I thought, now, Sid, really, we're in a corporation here, a global corporation. Like, how are you going to talk to these executives? Because I'd never seen him talk to executives before. By this time, he'd been talking with the psychologists and mental health people coming to the island. I'd seen him talking with them, but I thought, now this is another level here, Sid, talking to top level executives. How are you going to talk to them? Off we went to the park. He said to me, Elsie, you go off with this person and I will go off with this other person. We fed the squirrels. We met for lunch. We had the most incredible time with these executives. And that was my first experience of Sid doing team building at a corporate level. And this is just how he evolved, how he continued to evolve, was this spiritual essence continued to expand within him. Like when he had that enlightenment experience, he said, really, that was just the beginning. And I saw the proof in that he continued to grow. He continued to get deeper and deeper into the spiritual essence of life and beyond. It was extraordinary and continues to be extraordinary.
Oh, thank you for that, Elsie. I love the feeling you go into, and even more so, I think of just what you were saying about the arrogance of this guy, saying he had found the secret to life, the temerity of that. What kind of ego could he have had, someone with no experience starting to say all these things? And I remember him once saying something like, it would be ego to say this wasn't inside of you. That's your intellectual mind thinking you're not this thing. And yet, when you talked about that, the feeling you had, it just reminds me so much of the feeling of Sid and Barb together. And when I first met them, that's what I wanted. I wanted to be in that feeling. I wanted to wait my life to find that kind of love, to pursue that. And somehow that feeling, something about it, gave him the authority to speak. And not just with us. I mean, he was gentle with us in the beginning, mostly because I didn't know anything. I knew I didn't know anything, so I just listened. But he was so gentle with all of us, and yet he had the authority to speak this wisdom and share it. I remember the beginnings of that when the other people were in the island were changing. We saw so many changes, miracles. I mean, you say that with Sid, but people's bodies healing, people's mind, people that were marriages falling apart, and suddenly they were madly in love again. Children that were seriously ill, finding their way back home, families finding themselves, people that were distraught and finding healthy careers. It was like we were watching it always changing. It couldn't help but happen. Even just being around him, you got a glimpse. But by his change, he showed us what was possible. And we got to see that our dreams could come true. I mean, I know. I know he said that to me, my first conversation with him, and I believe to you that if you find this understanding of thought, all your dreams can come true. They are coming true. They're not just can, they are coming true. You can follow these dreams, and so many changes we saw. I know we don't often speak about all the other changes on the outside that happened, but people went inside. They found this feeling, they discovered their wisdom, and they changed their lives. And he was so gentle with us in those days, just by seeing he and Barb together, the way they loved each other. I mean, I can think of some of that time when we would go to his house in the beginning, sitting in the living room there in those big armchairs and the fireplace going and the clock going tick tock, and it would go slower and slower, and he'd talk a little bit, and then he and Barb would hold hands, and there'd just be such a beautiful, loving feeling. And yet it just permeated throughout the world. Suddenly people started arriving from everywhere and coming to the island. Can you tell me a little bit about what you saw in terms of the people that, and what you saw in the house? Did gently, because he could see we didn't understand, but he was so kind and sweet to us.
It really was the feeling, like right from the beginning, when he would saw our brows furrow, trying to figure out what he was saying, he would just say, like, don't try to figure it out. If you're getting a feeling, as he said in that insight tape, if you're getting a feeling, you're getting it. And it was the feeling that kept us close to his side during that resistant period for me. Because it was the feeling that kept me close. I wanted that feeling, as you said, I wanted that feeling, but just don't talk to me about this nonsense. The words and my figuring it out, my intellect would get in the way, but to just be with him as he was, as he just lived in the moment, in that feeling, that was sacred. That feeling is sacred. And I don't even know how the psychologist first heard about it. I know when Roger first came to the island, he'd heard something from another person, another psychologist that I don't know how he heard, that had come to the island, and Dr. George Pransky also knew this fellow. And they said to Roger, come to the island. There's something going on there, something very, very unique. People are getting healed, physically and mentally getting healed. And Roger was in the midst of a large mental health project trying to help people. And we were living on the island by this time. And so Sid invited us over when Roger and a colleague of his were arriving at Sid's place. And we were there when the car drove up, and Roger comes out, and he had his leg in a cast. He'd hurt his leg, sprained his leg or something, skiing. And so out comes Roger, and he's wearing kind of a white hippie-like top, and white pants and longer hair. And Ken and I had been very much into the hippie movement in those early days, but not very much. We were just too clean cut to get too much into it. And so when I saw Roger, I thought, this is a psychologist. Like, he didn't look like I thought he would be dressed in a suit and, very elegant and professional and kind of stern. Maybe I was thinking of Dr. Freud or something, I don't know, but Roger didn't fit the typical person. But Sid in his kindness and Barb and hers invite them in. And so I'm just kind of glued to this conversation. And Roger just asking Sid what he had found, and then hearing Sid talk about mental health, that everybody is born with mental health. And that really took Roger aback, that everybody was born with mental health. This was new to him, because he would go after people's problems. Like, that was what was current in the field of psychology in those days, was to fix people. And I remember Roger even saying that if he could actually get someone to cry in a session, he thought that was a good thing, that was relieving their stress. And so now here Sid is saying, no, it's love and understanding, and people are already born with this wisdom inside of them. So all you can do is is point to it and help draw it out. They'll do the rest. And so that started to happen for them too. And so more and more psychologists would come to the island, hearing about this mystery that was taking place. And there had been a lot of hippies on the island because it still is kind of that kind of a place where it's a loving place that opens their arms to people living an alternative lifestyle. And so those were the people that after Sid's enlightenment, when he would go down to the post office or maybe meet somebody for lunch or something, his presence, the feeling of his presence was like a magnet. And somehow people would hear him at a restaurant talking, quietly to maybe somebody that he had invited to lunch or a psychologist or mental health professional. And you would hear them kind of see them leaning over from their table, trying to overhear, to eavesdrop on what they were saying. And then he'd go downtown, and it was like the Pied Piper almost. He would go to the park, sometimes Centennial Park downtown, and maybe sit there and just enjoy the scenery and the boats coming and going, sailing into the harbor. And people would gather around him. They're just drawn by this energy. And a lot of the hippie element on the island, those that were living this alternative lifestyle, had a lot of physical and mental problems. And as Sid began to talk to them, not about their problems, but about their health, about their innate wisdom, about who they were at their spiritual core, I would see this too, sitting in Sid's front room. Oftentimes there'd be periods of silence that I'd never ever felt before, not even in the church I went to. I never felt that silence that I did start to hear and feel that silence in Sid's front room where he had his enlightenment experience. It was like there was this residue energy left in that front room. And whether you were a believer or a disbeliever, as Ken and I were in our early days, we felt that energy. We felt the silence, and it would quiet us. It would still our thinking. And then something might pop. Like we might not even know what it was that popped. We would just find ourselves resting in that feeling. And then when we would go home, oftentimes Ken and I would be holding hands. And we would see our children through the eyes of love. We wouldn't be after them, to do better in school or pick up their clothes or whatever. And their love for us grew. And so we began to see the island change. People that had been unemployed, partly because of mental and physical illness, had the confidence to start little stores, to build homes, to move out of really poor lodgings, find work, and take care of themselves. It became a thriving community. It was like the first community development project that later on took light at Modelo in Homestead Gardens, places like that Roger started, and then I worked in for like 13 years. The first community development project happened on Salt Spring without Salt Spring even knowing that was going on. It was kind of an under the table movement. Sid wouldn't have called it a community project. He just called it a healthy community. People finding love and understanding and wisdom to guide them to do better in life. And it spread. Word of mouth spread to the different cities locally, and then to the states, and now around the world, where there's, I think, 13 or 15 countries now that are translating Sid's videotapes online on Sid's YouTube.
I remember in those early days, Sid said, where truth comes, there has to be change. It has to change the world, because I don't even know why. It just has to change. And he said, you are the proof. You're the fruit on the tree. It'll come. And it seemed incredulous in the early time to say, you know, it'll change psychology and psychiatry forever. And yet it just happened. And I was very close to Roger. He was my degree supervisor in my graduate studies in psychology. And I remember him telling me, so I was always trained to look at the pathology and look at what was wrong. And I heard about a place where I wanted to find a healthy community. And this is what I heard. And that's why I went there. Something was going on. I wanted to find that health and start finding it himself. And I remember some of the early days when Roger was there, we'd be on the beach with Sid and make a little oyster baker. And Sid was so sweet the way he just wouldn't, usually it was just he'd speak, he'd be, but sometimes he'd ask questions of Roger because he didn't even know all the words in psychology, but he said, here, what do you think about this idea? And then Roger would kind of ponder it and say, well, it seems like a good path, that if you could discover that your world is just thinking, you'd be in a space to change that. And I remember the discovery was not just him teaching it, but him asking the psychologists that would come and drawing in the kindest way, because they were terrified, because they were going to have to throw away their degrees as far as they were concerned. And yet he was so kind and sweet to them in those early days. You remember seeing that. Can you tell us a little bit of that?
I do. I mean, gosh, I'm almost without words here, Shane. He taught us, because he illustrated it himself, about drawing out of people. And I found out later, Sid didn't know this, just intuitively, he knew to draw out, whether it was by questions or by a feeling that would open the doors of the conversation, where somebody, like say myself in those early days where I was so scared, where just being in his feeling for a while might encourage a question to come out of me without my volition, you know what I mean? Because his wisdom was drawing out my wisdom, and I wanted to know, my wisdom wanted to know more from this enlightened man. But I found out later that the true meaning of to teach is to draw out, not to impart, not to, push it in. It's to draw out. And I love that about the way Sid taught us. He taught us by example. He taught us when it was time to be still. He taught us not to overtalk. He taught us sometimes that if there were too many questions, to just let it sit, take a break, let the silence be the teacher. He taught us by example. And I remember, as time went on and Ken and I moved from Salt Spring and moved to Florida to do our work there. And after Barb's passing, I think it was maybe 5 years after Barb's passing, where he met Judy and found a loving relationship with Judy for the rest of his life. And to see that again, that life carries on, to see how, to be honest, how he handled Barb's passing, because he knows so deeply that she was going home. It helped him weather his personal loss. Now, I've not said that before. This is the first time I've shared that, but I saw that. Ken and I were witnesses to that, as were another couple who were there when Barb passed. And we saw that Sid went in and out of it personally, but because he knew that when he had his enlightenment, he would talk about it as, I went home. I found God. I found home. And I'm okay. And he said later, and he said this on tapes, on videotapes, that he said, you know, you hear people talking about dying and coming back again. He said, well, I died and I went through to the other side. And I came back to tell the story. I went through to the other side. And Ken and I were with him the day before he passed. And again, we saw how he was, where he knew he was going home. And he was at peace. And in our last hour together, we had a wonderful time talking about the old days and what it was like and what we'd all gone through. And I know that was a sacred time. And once again, he illustrated what he had found by leaving this earth, his physical being. And now here we are 50 years later, and having that tape came out again, that you did, that insight tape, that was the most detailed yet, is such a blessing, such a blessing. I'm beyond words now, Shane. So even if you had any more questions, I couldn't answer them.
No, we're all full of that love. I'm so grateful you shared that love, that feeling. That was what you always have been to me. That's really way beyond words. That's always what Sid was to me. That magical feeling. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank
The
you.
magical world you brought us into. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, 3PGC board. Thank you, Bonnie. I love you all.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye now.